The phone buzzed with one word, Sentinel, and Daniel knew, before he read the message, that someone had opened the drawer he'd locked for years. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. The rain came in thin, steady threads that night, like someone pulling a curtain across the world. Streetlights made wet glass glow the color of old pennies. Daniel Mercer walked under that light with his shoulders rounded, as if the weather wanted to press him down into himself. His jacket was too thin for the season and perfect for hiding the shape of his hands when they trembled, the small hitch in his walk, the slow way his eyes slid around a room before they settled. He kept his head low because he had learned that the easiest way to be invisible was to look as if you did not want to be seen. The diner on the corner was a rectangle of yellow warmth against the rain. A bell chimed when he pushed the door, and the heat hit him like a small lie. Nice, clean, temporary. Daniel chose a stool facing the window. He watched the street as he always did, not because he expected anything, but because watching felt like a kind of practice for the small, quiet violence of living. He ordered coffee black, no sugar. The waitress, her name was Claire, he had learned, moved with the easy efficiency of someone who had seen too many late nights and decided to make them routine. She did not look at him twice. From close, Daniel looked older than his paper said. The city had given him a thin kind of skin. Small, healed cuts at the knuckles, a faded sunburn line on his forearm, a scar that split the left eyebrow like a fault line. He used to tell himself those marks were proof of having lived. Lately, they felt like stubs of old debts. The tattoo beneath the sleeve of his left arm pulsed under the skin like a quiet heartbeat whenever he drank coffee too hot. He kept the sleeve down. Habit made him smooth the fabric over the ink the way a child smooths a comforter. There was a time he thought a name could be left behind like a coat. Daniel had hung his old name on a peg, walked out, and expected people to keep the peg empty. It had not worked. People collect stories the way other people collect postcards, one glance, and they know the place. He had learned, in small increments, how the past corners you, even in a diner with cracked linoleum and a jukebox that played old songs when no one asked it to. The worry now was less about being found and more about not being recognized by the right pair of eyes. Outside, a truck kicked up a spray of water and left his reflection in the glass. A man paused in a strip of light, mug of coffee steaming like a small chimney, the tattoo only hinted at through fabric. He flexed his fingers, then let them go. The motion was simple and private, a man counting himself like a budget no one wanted to balance. Nobody spoke to Daniel about the war. In a small town that let itself believe in tidy endings, the topic felt like a drafty room no one wanted to enter. When people asked where he had worked or where he came from, he offered answers that were measured and dull: contractor, handyman, traveling mechanic. The truth, too clean, too sharp, was a different weight. He kept that truth where men keep old tools, in a locked drawer, sterile and out of sight. The tattoo was part of that truth, a small map of names and numbers, and a symbol that belonged to a life now supposed to be private. An old jukebox thunked, and a country song about distant homes started like it had been waiting for him. He let the music fill the empty places between the rain and the coffee steam. A couple at the far end whispered in soft, easy tones. A boy in a baseball cap tapped his fingers on his phone, sending messages like a small river. Life continued in the diner as if Daniel were an afterthought, a background figure in someone else's photograph. If you had asked him, he would have said he wanted nothing more than a simple, quiet life. But simplicity is a hungry thing. It demands daylight, regularity, and the kind of trust that comes from being seen and still safe. Daniel had tried that and found it cracked. He had tried to soften his hands, to learn the names of local routes, to laugh when people spoke of easy, ordinary things. The laugh fit into his face like a loose tooth. At night, when the rain stopped and the city shut to a hush, the same images came back, the hard logic of a different sunrise, the smell of salt and diesel, the sound of men on watch, and he woke with his heart racing as if he were late for something he could no longer name. He paid his bill and stepped back into the rain. The cold slipped into his clothes and into the old places beneath them. He kept his hood up and walked toward the marina where he slept in a small room above a repair shop. The walk was 10 minutes, maybe 15, depending on how slow he allowed himself to be. He did not mind the job, waking older and tired and fixing things with hands that remembered different tools felt honest. But the nights, especially nights like this, were where the old life reached down and pulled. At the dock, boats clucked and creaked like sleeping birds. Daniel climbed the narrow stairs to the little room that held a second-hand cot, a box fan that did too much, and pictures on the wall he had bought at yard sales. Landscapes that cost less than the frames. He left the window open a crack because he liked the small sound of water breathing. The room smelled faintly of oil, rope, and old books, the smells of things with useful histories. He took off his jacket and rolled his sleeve for the ritual he had given himself, to wash the places that might give him away. The tattoo was not elaborate, a circle with numbers and a name burned into the skin in black and blue lines, but it meant something only a few people would know. He had assumed the sea, and the long travel would be enough camouflage. You would think running your hand over the ink would make it less, but it made it more as if the memory beneath the skin wanted to be noticed. He scrubbed with a bar of soap until the water on his arm ran gray. Then he sat still and watched the small traces of ink drift like tired minnows toward the grain. There was a photograph taped to the headboard, half peeled, a younger Daniel, his hair shorter, arms slung round other men with faces like broken light. In the photo, he smiled like someone who still believed the world had rules that were fair. He did not remember when he had stopped believing that. He held the picture until his fingers started to cramp and put it back. From the street below came the faint sound of boots, 2 sets, close, purposeful. He froze, the photograph slipping from his fingers and landing face down on the pillow. The boots were quick, light, like someone moving through rain with a purpose that was not a weight. For a second, he felt the old reflex, shoulders tightening, breath stilled, hands finding invisible weapons. The reflex was a thing of muscle memory. It lived in the bones now, in the tendon that tightened when danger hovered, real or imagined. But the sound faded as boots often do in the city, and Daniel sighed into the quiet. He told himself it was nothing, that the town had more people now than when he had come, that most pairs of boots carried dogs and grocery errands, and not the long, tidy business of the past. He put the photo away and turned the light off. In the dark, he listened to the small universe of the room. A neighbor's radio skipping between stations, the fan's slow whir, the harbor's distant hush. The night wrapped itself around him like a blanket. For a while, he almost allowed himself to sleep. Sleep is a dangerous thing for men like Daniel because dreams are craftsmanship. They take ordinary pieces and assemble them into working machines that can run you down. He dreamt of a street he had walked before, only the shops had different names, and the faces were sketchy. A young man stood under a light and looked at him like someone trying to remember an old lyric. The young man's gaze fixed on the sleeve of Daniel's coat, where the tattoo lay hidden. In the dream, the man reached out as if to touch the ink, and Daniel woke with his hand on his arm, fingers splayed over nothing. When dawn found him, it was thin and patient. He dressed and walked down the stairs to the shop where he worked, nodding to the owner, a quiet woman named Sarah who never asked too many questions. He had learned to like Sarah because she accepted the short answers with a smile and never probed into the spaces behind his eyes. The repair bay smelled of oil, rubber, and coffee. He set to work on a small motor like a man attending a familiar altar. His hands moved as they always had. Precise, economical, the way a man who had once known how to stop something from falling apart now kept smaller things together. As he worked, a group of young men came in with the sort of energy that made rooms vibrate. One of them, taller, clean-cut, with a haircut that said military in a new way, stood at the edge of a shop and watched Daniel like someone reading a foreign book slowly, tracing each line with a finger. The young man's presence did not unsettle Daniel. He had learned to carry the world's curiosity like a bar of soap, rinse it off, and set it down. The younger man introduced himself as Michael Price. He had the loose confidence of someone who had been taught to trust himself early and loudly. Michael's eyes were quick and direct. They moved in small, efficient arcs that surveyed and stored. He asked about the motor, about parts, about the cost of fixing an old outboard. His voice was practical, questions, not stories. Michael's interest felt casual, like the small interest of tourists who like to know how things work. But when he laughed, something in Daniel tightened. The laugh was the kind of clear sound of a man used to being part of a team. When Michael turned his wrist, the sleeve of his jacket slid up, brief, accidental, and for the first time Daniel saw the edge of a tattoo on the young man's forearm. Simple black lines, a small symbol that was different from Daniel's, but close in a way that made Daniel's chest clench. Daniel kept working. He answered questions the way he always did. Short, factual, and careful. But he watched the young man in the small way that men watch things that could be dangerous, the way you watch a dog that might bite, the way you watch whether that might change fast. The tattoo was tiny like a footnote, and when Michael's hand moved it caught the light and made the ink flicker. A small bell above the shop door chimed as another customer left. The world was simply moving. But in the motion there was a thread that, when you pulled on it, could unravel what you thought you had sewn closed. Daniel felt that thread under his skin, a vibration as thin as a wire, and he found himself smoothing his shirt over his own hidden mark as if to pretend it was not there. He did not look up. He told himself he was being foolish. He told himself it was only rain and coffee and a young man who needed a motor fixed. Still, when you have a secret, even simple things can feel like traps. The tattoo was a small map. The world, as ever, had a way of following maps. The morning Michael came back to the repair bay, the light had the thin, nervous quality of early April, as if the sky had not yet decided whether to be kind. Daniel was kneeling by the outboard, grease on his knuckles, when the bell over the door sounded. He looked up out of habit and saw Michael standing there, coat zipped, hands jammed into pockets, the sort of stance that said he had something on his mind and wasn't planning to leave until it was spoken. "Morning," Sarah said without looking, wiping her hands on a rag. "You need parts." Michael smiled, but the smile was small and tight. "Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to see if the man who fixed my last motor could make miracles twice." He stepped closer, and up close Daniel noticed the way his jaw set. There was a tension there that matched the neat line of a man used to following orders. They measured the motor in silence. Words hung like tools on a pegboard, within reach but not chosen. Daniel answered the practical questions first: how long it would take, what it would cost, whether the part might need replacing. Michael listened, then tilted his head and asked something Daniel did not expect. "You been in?" Michael said, simply, "For what?" Daniel's hands paused. Oil dripped off a screw and made a small, dark dot on the concrete. "Service." Michael said, the way one asks how many cups of coffee a stranger drinks. "Military, Navy, SEALs, anything like that." Daniel felt the room was narrow. He kept working, though. It was easier to keep hands busy than to let the mind find its old tracks. "No," he said, "just odd jobs. Boats mostly." Michael's eyes flicked to Daniel's forearm. He didn't stare. His glance was brief, like someone scanning a page for a date. Daniel's sleeve covered the tattoo, but the edge of it showed where fabric rode up as he moved. Michael's breath hiccuped, a small, involuntary sound, and his hand went to his own forearm as if to check something there. For a moment, the world felt like the diner window in reverse, a picture with the back torn out. Daniel kept the oil-stained screwdriver steady, though his pulse kicked against his wrist. He had been careful for years. He had folded his old life up small and hidden it under a larger, neutral life. He had counted on the small town's indifference and the old fog of people's short memories. He had not counted on someone who wore recognition like a lit match. Michael's hand slid from his sleeve. When he turned his wrist, the tattoo on his own forearm, a small, blunt symbol, caught the light. It was not Daniel's mark, but it was close enough. It was the same family of ink, the same cramped letters, the same half-remembered geometry. For reasons Daniel could not name, his chest pulled tight, as if a net had been cast over it. "Where did you get that?" Michael asked, voice softer. "Got it a long time ago," Daniel said. The answer was a stone tossed into a still pond. The ripples would not stop. He wiped his hands on his rag, the motion an old ritual of keeping calm. Michael's eyes were earnest, then a dangerous earnestness. You know what this means, right? Daniel kept his face blank. He knew more than most about what marks meant. A tattoo could be a map, a badge, a calendar of debts. It could be a name that stayed with you even when you asked it to leave. Depends on who's reading it. Michael folded his hands, jaw working. He set a small photo on the counter between them. The picture was battered and soft at the edges. It had been folded and refolded like an old letter. Daniel recognized men in uniforms, faces that were sunburned or grimy, smiles that looked borrowed and thin. One face made the breath leave Daniel's chest. It was young, sharp, eyes like dark glass. The man wore the same tattoo Daniel hid beneath his sleeve, the ink unmistakable in its placement. Ethan, Michael said, "My brother." He disappeared in, he stopped as if swallowing a date would make it bigger. They called it an operation gone bad. Lost contact. Bodies never found. Everyone assumed the worst. Daniel did not touch the photograph. He did not let Michael see that his fingers wanted to curl over the paper like a hand reaching for a log on a rough shore. Names and faces were small doors that could open into the rooms he worked, so hard to keep locked. "You said disappeared," Daniel said carefully. "You mean presumed dead?" "Our unit kept digging," Michael said. "Search teams, reports, family stuff." It was messy. There were rumors, too, about what happened out there. People said things they shouldn't have said. My mother didn't accept it. She moved towns. She put pictures in every room. Ethan was young. He had that look like he could fix whatever was broken and set it right. Michael's voice changed. It became lower and more private. He leaned forward. "I saw the tattoo on you and my blood went cold. I thought I was seeing things. I thought," he fumbled for the right word, "I thought maybe I was remembering wrong." Daniel thought of 1,000 ways to answer. He thought of the way his own name had drifted away, of the nights when he had woken with his hands curled like fists and not known which life belonged to which scar. He thought of the men in the photograph who had once been his family of sorts. Saying nothing had been his currency, he had bartered silence for safety. But the photograph on the counter was a coin he could not afford to let Michael flip. "I wasn't with Ethan's team," Daniel said at last. His voice was steady, but the words had the feel of a man stepping over thin ice. Names and symbols can be shared. People get the same thing for different reasons. Michael's eyes narrowed, not hostile, but searching. "Maybe, but your tattoo, it's in the same place, same line work. And the way you move, your shoulders, there's something, Daniel. I don't know why I recognize it, but something about you feels like a place I used to know." Hearing his name said aloud in that tone was like someone lifting his shirt and seeing beneath. Daniel felt stripped to the bone for a moment, naked and answering. He wanted to run. He wanted to push away the small, impossible hope that had crept into him. Recognition could be a kindness and it could be a threat. Daniel had learned both meanings in one hurried, razor-edged lesson. "What do you want?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it felt like the hinge between two rooms. Michael's face went soft, an expression that held confusion and pain and something that might have been fear. He folded the photograph back into his wallet, protecting it like it was fragile and dangerous at the same time. "I don't know," he said. "I know the mark when I see it. I know what it did to my family. I know what it might mean if it's true." He shrugged, a small, inelegant motion. "I wasn't planning to start anything. I came for a motor. But I can't not ask. If you are who I think you are, if you're connected to Ethan's story, then maybe we can talk. Maybe you can tell me what happened." Daniel listened to the words and felt a door open within him he had sealed for years. He remembered nights in different lights, the roar of engines and the close, shared silence of men waiting for a signal that might never come. He remembered an operation with a wrong turn, a sky that emptied, and the terrible exact fear that followed. He remembered decisions that had been made under orders and sometimes under panic. He had buried many things to survive. Now a young man with a steady jaw and a photo could call him up like a bell. Talk isn't always safe, Daniel said. For you or for me? I get that. Michael's answer was blunt. I served. I can handle secrets, but my family deserves the truth. If you're not involved, tell me. If you are, tell me. I'm not here to punish. I just want to know. In the silence that followed, Daniel felt the axis of his life lean. For years, he had walked a path of small, obedient steps. Find a job, fix a motor, tuck the past out of sight. Recognition by a man like Michael was not an accident. It was a pivot. It could mean reckoning. It could mean rescue. It could mean both. You need to understand something, Daniel began. Whatever you're hoping for, whatever you fear, the truth isn't clean. It has edges that cut. It has allies you did not expect and enemies you thought were friends. Michael nodded, as if the admission of mess made the world more honest. I expected to be clean, Daniel. I expected to find a straight line. Life didn't give me that. Maybe it never does. Outside the shop, a delivery truck backed up with a loud, mechanical cough. Inside, the day moved on. Sarah hummed and wiped surfaces. The radio played a pop song 2 decades old, and a regular customer called in about a leaking hull. Yet between the everyday sounds there was now another sound, something like the first small crack in glass. Daniel folded his rag and kept his face even. The photograph on the counter was a small thing with the power to split days. Michael waited, patient and unhurried in a way that suggested he had practice with long aims. He wore the uniform of a young man with orders and purpose, and in his eyes Daniel saw both curiosity and a need that felt personal. What do you want from me right now? Daniel asked. Michael looked at him like a man offering a hand across a gulf. A conversation. Truth, if you can bear it. We'll start there. Daniel let out a breath he had held for years. The offer was simple and dangerous. It was also human. For a moment, he pictured the photograph on his own bedside table, the men in it like ghosts who had a right to more than silence. He wrapped his sleeve down over the tattoo, as if to touch it, to feel the old map under his skin, and then he covered his hand in his palm. All right, he said, we talk, but not here. Not with Sarah and the shop. There are things I can't say in the open. Michael's face softened, relief like rain. Name a place. Daniel thought for a long second. The marina felt suddenly too small and too public, and yet, oddly, it was also the one place where he had kept no secrets about who he was not. There's a bench by the old lighthouse, he said finally. Come tonight. 8. Bring the photograph. Bring anything else you want. Michael nodded. He put the photograph back in his wallet as if sealing a pact. He paid for the parts and left, his footsteps light, on the shop's worn floor. But the air in the bay felt heavier when it was gone. When the door closed behind him, Daniel realized that life had already shifted. He had lived long enough to know that the simplest gestures could begin a war or begin a cure. Standing there with oil on his hands and the photographs go still in his chest, he understood the truth of Michael's presence. Recognition was a small thing with large consequences. It could open the locked drawer or it could force it wider than he intended. Either way, the quiet life he had been building was no longer a sure thing. The lighthouse bench smelled faintly of salt and tar, as if the sea itself kept a small ledger of every conversation ever had there. Daniel arrived early, hood pulled low though the sky was clear, and sat with his hands folded. He watched the water. It steadied him the way a rhythm steadies a song. Waiting was a skill he'd learned in a different life. Wait, watch, answer only when necessary. Michael came at 8 as promised, carrying the photograph in a worn wallet and the kind of careful hope that made his shoulders narrow with purpose. Up close, he was younger than Daniel had first thought, less the hard-edged veteran and more a man shaped by duty and by a family that kept its grief like a taut rope. He sat down beside Daniel as if the bench were a single body that needed 2 shoulders to balance. You could have brought someone else, Daniel said first. His voice was low, used to being muffled by engines and night. Michael shook his head. No, it's me. I have to do this. Mom pushed me to look. She says not knowing is worse than the worst possible answer. He paused. Her name is Laura. She's stubborn. Daniel let the names sit between them like an offered cup. He had known women like Laura, women who refused the comfort of easy endings. They made grief an active thing. They refused to file it away. You said Ethan disappeared on an operation, Daniel said. You said bodies were never found. Michael nodded. Search and rescue called it. Intelligence had a different word, but there were gaps. The unit had orders that didn't make sense. We all had questions. I grew up on those questions. Daniel picked at a loose thread on his sleeve and let a silence fall that was not empty. People who look for answers usually break something along the way, he said, not unkind. Sometimes the truth is not a rescue. It's a wound that never stops opening. Michael swallowed. I know that, but my family deserves to know whether Ethan is gone or whether he was taken or whether his voice caught, and he looked out to sea as if the horizon might cough up an explanation. They talked in small pieces then, like tradesmen swapping tools. Michael asking about names, dates, units, Daniel answering in fragments. He would not tell the whole story, but he allowed small windows. He let Michael know about the region Ethan had been sent to, about a convoy that never reached its marked time, about radio silence that turned hours into questions. He left out the parts he had buried for his own reasons, the orders he had received, the choices he had made in a smoke-filled tent. He left out the faces that had fallen under a different sky. Michael listened like a man building a map from fragments. He asked things that exposed him. How Daniel moved in a firefight, how he slept, whether he trusted his instincts. Daniel answered with a mix of pragmatism and the kind of softness that comes from knowing you cannot hide everything. Each answer made Michael's face colder or softer in small, telling ways. You've been careful, Michael said at one point. You keep to the marina, you fix motors, you don't volunteer information. But I saw how your hand moved over your sleeve back there. People who hide do it because they think it's safer. I thought it was, Daniel replied, once. Michael glanced at the photo again. Why did you leave? He asked, the question a slow blade. If you knew things, if you saw things, why disappear into a life like this? Daniel's laugh was a short, dry thing, because sometimes disappearing is the only way to not be used as an example. Because sometimes the orders stop making sense, and you have to pick a life that pretends you never understood the rulebook. I did what I could do, and then I walked. That's not noble. It's survival. Michael seemed to understand survival. He had it in his jaw, and in the way he said the word mom, as if it were both shield and wound. My brother believed in following orders, he said softly. That's what makes this harder. He trusted the chain. He trusted the people above him. If something went wrong, how do you tell a mother that her son trusted the wrong chain? The truth of that question hung between them. Michael wanted a clean answer. Daniel had no clean answers. He had choices and consequences, and each choice carried weight that did not lift with time. They spoke of other things, too, small human details that made them real. Daniel told a story about a broken radio he had fixed once on a stormy night, the kind of small, ordinary victory that tasted like an apology. Michael talked about Laura baking bread to calm herself after sleepless nights, about how she left one chair at the table for a son who might never come home. The stories softened them, made both men less like roles and more like people who had learned the grammar of pain. At one point, Sarah's voice came over Daniel's phone. He had left it with her, and she asked a question about a part. Daniel's answer was quick, familiar, and he returned the phone to the pocket as if resuming an older role. He told Michael about Sarah, the woman who ran the shop, and who kept her past like a second-hand coat, comfortable and practical and lacking in pleasant frills. Sarah cared in a careful way. She asked no hard questions. She offered soup when repairs ran late. Daniel liked that. What do you want me to do if I find out the truth? Michael asked suddenly, if there's something we can do to, I don't know, bring him back or bring someone to justice, what then? Daniel turned the question over in his mouth, like a coin. Truth doesn't always come with tools attached. Sometimes it comes with a list of new problems you didn't have yesterday. If you want to bring someone to justice, you need allies and proof. And sometimes allies have their own agendas. Michael's face hardened. Who would have an agenda? The command? A contractor? someone who benefits from them not being found. Daniel did not answer right away. He thought of men with neat hands who signed papers and men in suits who whispered directions down closed corridors. He thought of contractors who profited on chaos and of officials who counted good press as a ledger. There are always people who prefer a story to stay buried. There are also people who profit when it stays buried. He said finally, "You need to be careful about who you trust, Michael." The young man's eyes narrowed. "Are you telling me there's someone trying to hide them?" "I'm telling you to be careful who you trust when they offer help." Daniel's tone was blunt, anchored. Not everyone who wants to help is on your side. Sometimes help is a way to get you to open a door you didn't know led to a trap. Michael listened, then laughed, a small, bitter sound. "So, we trust no one. Great. That narrows my options." They both smiled in the way people do when discomfort needs easing. The laugh broke some tension, but it did not dissolve the unease. The world had teeth. Both men had felt them. As dusk fell, Michael rose to leave and folded the photograph back into his wallet as if it were a talisman. "I'll find out more," he said. "I have a contact, an old unit friend, who now works at a private firm. He owes me favors. If there's anything, I'll come to you. If you remember anything, any names, any places, call me." Daniel watched him go and felt a mix of relief and dread. He was relieved that the conversation had not yet demanded everything from him. He felt dread because contact meant visibility, visibility meant risk. He thought of Ethan's face in the photograph, smiling with a trust that had become a ghost. Daniel wondered whether that trust had been used, and if so, by whom. After Michael left, Daniel walked down to the marina alone, the sound of boards creaking underfoot like a metronome. He thought about trust and betrayals as if they were tools he had once used and now misplaced. He knew there were secrets in his life that he kept for the safety of others, and he knew there were secrets he had kept to protect himself. The two were not the same, though they could look similar in the dark. Alone, he allowed himself a small confession he had never given voice to. He had once considered telling Ethan the truth about the operation, about the risks, but he had stopped. He had thought he could protect him by silence. That quiet choice gnawed at him now, the same way rust eats metal from inside. As he left the marina and walked back toward the small room above the repair shop, the town's lights blinking like distant eyelids, Daniel understood that things had changed. Michael's presence had opened a window he could not easily close. He had felt the soft pressure of being recognized, the subtle pull of consequences. Somewhere beyond small talk and photographs, forces were already shifting. Friendships might become liabilities. Allyships might be betrayals. And a single photograph, folded into a slim wallet, could start a chain reaction that no one wished to count. He did not yet know which side of the reaction he would stand on. He only knew one thing with a stubborn, terrible clarity. Secrets had a way of stepping into the light, and when they did, they rarely returned to the dark the same. Daniel stopped by the shop after dark because he had left his wrench in the drawer, a small, honest excuse for being there late. The moon was a sliver, and the marina smelled like cold metal and old rope. He unlocked the back door with the key Sarah kept for him, a courtesy she had given months ago when a lock snapped at closing. The shop was a rectangle of soft light and shadow. Tools hung like sleeping birds. He glanced at the workbench where he'd left the motor and then headed for the tiny office Sarah used to keep the books. The door was ajar. A lamp burned on the desk in a pool of yellow. Daniel paused at the threshold because the sight of something open when it should be closed always felt like an invitation and a threat at the same time. He pushed the door wider with the same slow care he used to open boxes that might contain brittle pages. The chair by the desk was empty. A half-drunk mug steamed faintly, and a laptop glowed with an inbox like a small town lit up on a map. There were emails with polite subject lines. Monthly update, site report, but one subject line made the inside of Daniel's throat go dry. Sentinel payment. He didn't know what the word should mean for him, but for some reason it made his muscles agree. He stepped closer. On the screen, a message preview showed a short note. Report delivered. Keep an eye. Grant is calling tomorrow. Another window showed a scanned receipt, one-time transaction, 1,200 Sentinel Dynamics. The phone on the desk buzzed. Daniel's name flashed for a second, an incoming call from an unknown number, and then stopped. His heart tapped against his ribs like a small fist. He heard movement behind him and froze. Sarah came in from the back, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face tightened when she saw him standing in the doorway, like a man who'd been waiting for bad news. "Daniel," she said low and quick. The word was equal parts apology and defense. How long have you been there?" "A minute," he said. He let his voice be neutral because the last thing he wanted was to make an unsteady woman feel smaller than she already did. "You left the desk open." She sat down, fingers trembling. The kitchen light painted her hands the color of tea. For a moment, she looked like a woman who had tried to set a pot on too high heat and only then realized the scorch was already there. "Sarah, what Sentinel Dynamics?" Daniel asked. The name tasted wrong in his mouth, modern and clinical, and the sort of thing that paid people to be quiet or loud when the money fit the purpose. Sarah swallowed. Her eyes flicked to the laptop, then away. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said. "It's complicated." "Their names on your payments," Daniel said plainly. "You've been getting money from them." "I needed help," she said. "Too fast." The back rent was due. The zoning fine from the Harbor Council came through, and they said they'd shut us if I didn't clear it. I tried the bank, I tried loans. "Michael," she stopped, and the way she stopped made the word a bruise. "They came and offered to help keep the shop open. They said a little information, little things, would be enough. I told them about customers, nothing big. I thought it was background stuff. I told them about men who asked about boats, about times people were here. I never meant," her voice folded inward, "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Daniel felt his breath slow, the air compressed in his chest, as if someone had tightened a band around it. Betrayal does not always arrive in a single shout. Sometimes it comes in small, pragmatic choices made under pressure. A ledger entry, a whispered name, an envelope slid across a table. He had trusted Sarah because she had been that small, luminous thing in his life, the person who accepted terse answers and did not pry. Now, the trust felt like a window left open in winter. "When did they start?" he asked quietly. "Last spring," she said, "when the council threatened the shop. At first, it was payments for advertising, like helping bring more customers to a small business. Then Michael's contact showed up at the door once. Her hands folded in her lap, like someone trying to fold away a storm. I didn't know. I thought they were looking for leads on contractors. They needed people who knew the docks. I told what I knew. I thought it would be enough. Names of boats, times, maybe faces. I didn't tell them your name. I swear I didn't." Daniel remembered the slip of paper in the office earlier that week, a delivery notice with Sentinel stamped in the corner. He had seen it and let it slide. He should have stood there then and asked more. That small hesitation had been a choice. Now the consequence was a map with the edges burned. "How do they know about tattoos?" Daniel asked. "How did they see any of that?" Sarah's face crumpled. "I don't know. They asked about people who'd served. They asked if anyone came through town who looked like they might have been away for a long time. I told them." She stopped and pressed her thumb into her palm until the skin went white. "I told them about someone who once sat by the bench. I gave them a description. I didn't know they'd make it a thing to follow up on. They said they were trying to clear up old cases," she whispered, and the air in the room suddenly tasted like old coins and regret. Daniel's hands curled into fists. He wanted to strike anyone, for the smallness of her choices that had enormous effect. He wanted to scream that life is not a ledger entry. But underneath the anger was a slow, lengthening recognition. Sarah's betrayal had not been malicious. It had been survival in a form he understood too well. People bartered pieces of themselves when the market demanded. Before he could respond, the office phone rang. Sarah answered in a reflex, voice softer than before. "Hello," she said. A man's voice came over the line, smooth, corporate, and patient. "Ms. Hart," he said, "this is Grant. Sentinel thanks you for your cooperation. We have a new directive. Keep the report flow steady. We'll need updates on anyone with the mark. And remind your friend Daniel that surveillance is best for everyone. The last part was almost casual, like a man reminding someone to water a plant. The laugh in Daniel's chest was a dry thing. Grant. The name had appeared on the laptop. Now it had a voice. The voice was not loud, but the words were precise. Surveillance is best for everyone. Translated, we know where you are. Sarah's fingers shook on the handset. He's in here, she whispered. He's in the room. There was a long pause on the phone. Then Grant said, Good. Keep him convenient, Miss Hart. The phone went dead. Sarah hung it up with a sob that was more animal than human. You knew, Daniel said. He wanted to be furious for the record, to mark the place where trust had been split open. You knew they wanted people with the mark. She nodded. They never said who. They said the mark, as if the tattoo was a loose word. I didn't know you'd be the one. The anger burned, but a different feeling came after it, something colder and clearer. The betrayal was not only Sarah's. Someone else had orchestrated this, someone with cash and reach. Sentinel Dynamics sounded like a corporation that could rent away the world's edges. If they were tracking veterans by tattoo, then Ethan's disappearance took on a different color entirely. This wasn't an accident of war. It looked like a system. As if on cue, the shop door opened and Michael stepped inside. He stood in the doorway, shoulders set, a rain-smeared jacket clinging dark to his frame. For a moment, Daniel could only look at him. The younger man's face was a map of fatigue and worry. He held his wallet up like someone who had walked a long road and kept one fragile thing with him. Daniel. Michael's voice fell between them like a question. He looked from the laptop to Sarah to Daniel, and the photograph in his hand was folded tight. I didn't know they were paying anyone, he said. I thought, Sarah, they told me they were a foundation. They said they were helping families. I asked them for help finding Ethan. They promised to fund a proper search. They said they would coordinate with the unit. Daniel watched Michael's expression. The young man's face shifted, shame, then a hardening. I went to them because Laura needed answers, he said. They said they had resources. They told me we'd have access to files, to people who could move things forward. I thought I was getting help. I didn't think. You were the bait, Daniel said. The words were not a question. Michael flinched. What? Your search brought them here, Daniel said. You came to a guy who hides and told him about tattoos and units and operations. Someone with enough money and reach heard that and made a program out of it. They paid for information. They've been monitoring movement. Sarah handed them descriptions. They've been keeping tabs on veterans. Michael's face crumpled then, and Daniel saw in it something raw, grief that morphed into personal guilt. I thought I was doing the right thing, Michael said. I thought I was bringing a solution. I didn't realize they'd use it to hunt people. Sarah sobbed then, a quick, sharp sound. They came the day after you talked, she said. A man left the envelope with the payment and asked if I could keep quiet about it. He said it would be for good, helping families compensation for people who had been left without answers. They made it sound noble. I regret it, Daniel. I swear, I regret it. The betrayal was now two-pronged. One blade was blunt and market-based, money made of promises. The other was a personal knife. Michael, who had come with a photograph and a doubt, had unwittingly brought a predator. Daniel felt dizzy at the way his life had been negotiated in small offices and polite emails. Do you understand what they want? He asked, voice flat. They don't want answers for families. They want a map of veterans. They want leverage. They probably sell it. Contracts, services, quiet options. Ethan's disappearance. What if it wasn't the result of a battlefield error? What if it was deliberate? What if Sentinel Dynamics exploited that to build a list of men with access, with knowledge? Michael's hands curled into fists. We were trying to find him, he said. We thought asking for help would get us closer. I never expected them to buy people's silence and use the rest as inventory, Daniel finished for him. The truth settled like ash. The world was more complicated and more dangerous than either of them had wanted to accept. Trust had a price, and the price had just been paid in human quiet. The twist was a slow, terrible thing. The search for truth had become a hunt. The people who promised help had considered veterans as data points and liabilities. The photograph in Michael's wallet, the payments to Sarah, the talk of surveillance, all of it pointed to something larger and sinister. Daniel had been trying to disappear, to make himself small. Now, the smallness made him a perfect mark. He thought of Ethan's face in the photograph and felt something jagged open in his chest. The man he had once counted on might be a pawn, a casualty, or something else entirely. And the people who were closest to him, Sarah, who sealed her trust with a pledge of loyalty, Michael, who loved his brother and reached for help that became a leash, had been folded into the machine. Outside, the harbor wind picked up and rattled a loose shutter like someone knocking on a door. Daniel stood up slowly, each movement careful, so as not to spill his thoughts. The world had changed shape beneath him. Allies could be sellers, help could be bait. The town that had seemed like a shelter was now a grid of small betrayals. "I need to know what they know," Daniel said at last, his voice low and steady. "I need to track where the payments came from, whose grant, what files they have. And you," he looked at Michael, "you need to tell Laura the truth about what happened. She deserves better than promises." Michael's face broke into something like resolve. "I'll tell her," he said. "I'll tell her everything. And I'll fight them. I promise." Sarah's apology came again, small and endless. "I'm sorry," she said. "If there's anything I can do—" Daniel listened to the apology like a man who had counted the cost. He did not know if forgiveness was possible. What he knew was that the game had changed. The first twist had pulled back a curtain and revealed a roomful of men and women in suits, watching lists and buying silence. The truth about Ethan's fate was no longer a small mystery. It was part of an economy that turned people into products. He left the shop with the lamp light, painting the road, and the marina sounded darker than before. The town's soft noises, waves on hulls, distant radios, were reminders that life kept moving, indifferent to individual calamity. But Daniel felt the weight of the knowledge like a stone in his pocket. Someone powerful was watching, people he had trusted had been compromised, and the photograph of Ethan had ignited a machine that now wanted more than answers. The night smelled of salt and money and the thin metallic tang of fear. Daniel walked into it knowing that nothing could be put back the way it had been. The map was out. The hunt was on. The days after the Sentinel payment were a slow pressure, like someone tightening a band around a drum. Daniel found that ordinary things no longer felt ordinary. He checked locks twice instead of once. He moved tools from one drawer to another and then back again. He noticed headlights that lingered a little too long outside the repair shop. He watched his own hands as if they might betray him and give away a map he no longer wanted anyone to read. Michael kept his promise in the small way he could. He visited the marina, sometimes bringing Laura with him. Laura was smaller in person than she looked in photographs, but her presence had a gravity that pulled at the air around her, an insistence that grief be named and not hidden. She sat with Daniel on the bench near the lighthouse and listened without flinching when he spoke in careful halves. He told her what he could, where Ethan had been deployed, what the unit's last messages had said, the holes that intelligence reports had left. He left out the things that hurt too much to speak, decisions he had made under orders, the time he had told himself he protected them by keeping silent. Laura did not push at the missing pieces then. She folded her hands on her knees and said things like, "Thank you," and "We just want to know," which sounded simple and terrible at once. Michael watched Daniel with a new kind of wariness, the way someone does when they see a map with a missing corner. He still trusted Daniel, but the trust had edges now, and Michael carried the photograph like a talisman that could warm them or scorch them. Sentinel Dynamics did not slow down. The payments continued to Sarah's account, neat wires labeled as consulting fees and community outreach. Grant's emails shifted in tone from polite and corporate to colder and more efficient. "Keep him convenient," he had said, and convenience had its own machinery. Daniel found scrapings on the back door of the room above the shop, nothing decisive, just marks that could have been from wind or prying hands. He found a thumbtack pushed into the outer lip of his mailbox, bright and out of place. He found a small, high-resolution photograph slipped beneath his windshield wiper one morning. An image of him at the bench, taken from a distance, the lighthouse in the frame like a witness. No message, only the photo, glossy and patient. He could go to the police. He thought about it and pictured a desk piled with paperwork, a young officer filing a report with the kind of sympathy that felt thin. He thought about Sentinel's reach, about men in suits who used euphemisms and invoices to move what they wanted. He had seen men with uniforms bend rules into new shapes. He had also seen neat offices turn away inconvenient questions. The choice sat heavy. Two paths that both promise pain in different measures, the public route with its slow gears and bright lights, or the quieter, more dangerous path of doing it himself. That was the moral tension that pulled at him every waking hour. If he went public, he might save others from being tracked, expose a company that treated veterans like inventory, and perhaps force answers about Ethan. But publicity can also bring predators into light. Sentinel's model seemed designed for visibility. They wanted to find people and then control the narrative. If Daniel turned himself into a talking head, he risked putting Laura and Sarah and Michael in the crosshairs. If he stayed silent, he let a market operate on human lives. He thought about the men in the photograph again, Ethan, younger and unsuspicious, his mouth in a smile he probably would not have shown to the camera now. Each time Daniel looked at the image, the memory of a night when orders shifted and a plan unspooled tinged his decisions with shame. He had not told Ethan everything then. He had rationed truth, as if withholding it would cause consequences. Guilt had a habit of multiplying like mold in damp places. Now it pressed on him. By not speaking before, had he let a larger machine take hold? The external threats escalated, as if acknowledging his internal wrestling. One night, after he closed up, Daniel walked the dock and found Sarah waiting with her coat lifted tight around her. She looked as if someone had carved worry into her face. Her hands shook when she handed him an envelope. "It slid under my door," she said. "No note, just this." Inside was a photocopy of a ledger page, dates, names, times, a clumsy list that hinted at scheduling and logistics. At the bottom of the page were initials, SD, and a tiny symbol that matched the logo Daniel had seen on the payment receipts. Someone had given them a map. "Are you going to the police?" she asked, voice thin. Daniel held the paper, like a man holding a hot coal. "If we go there, we have to be sure we can survive the light," he said. "We can't hand over pieces of someone's life and then watch them be used as bait." He wanted to sound decisive. Inside, tremors moved through him. Michael arrived soon after, having driven over from his mother's house. He'd spoken to his contact once and found that the man had folded under pressure from senior partners. He said, "Check the books," Michael told them. He said, "Sometimes those firms are run through shell accounts. They funnel money through charities, then into private contracts." He said, "I should be careful who I let help." Michael's jaw had that set, like a man who had learned a hard truth and then made it practical. At night, the shop felt like a brittle thing to be protected. Daniel installed a cheap camera he found at a pawn shop and hid it in the rafters. He rewired a lamp to flicker when motion happened at the back door. It was small armor, things that made him feel like he had control. Yet control remained stubbornly partial. The ledger had come through a slot he had thought secure. Sentinel had methods beyond simple surveillance. They had money and legal teams and a public face in Grant that spoke in soft, inexorable sentences. The hardest internal challenge arrived in the form of a question Michael asked one evening, his voice low and blunt. "If you had been honest with Ethan, if you had told him everything, do you think he'd still be gone?" Daniel did not like the question. He knew why Michael asked. It was a search for a cause, a place to pin blame, an attempt to make sense of an absence by mapping it to a human act. Daniel saw the question in the same way he saw his own reflection in a rain puddle distorted by ripples. He answered slowly. Maybe he'd have made a different choice. Maybe he would have stayed. Maybe he'd have left. People are not single decisions. We are long collections of choices and regrets. "But you were there," Michael said. "You were the one who left. You walked away." When we were given orders, they were not always clear, Daniel said. Sometimes following them felt like the only way to keep men alive in the short term. Sometimes orders led to mistakes. Maybe I left because walking away felt less damaging than standing and watching men die to satisfy paperwork. He did not offer absolution. He could not. That night, the camera caught movement at 2 in the morning, an image uploaded to Daniel's phone with a jolt. The silhouette of a man lingered near the back door, hands in his pockets. Then he turned and walked away. The resolution wasn't great, but the curve of the skull seemed like someone who wore a hat often. Daniel rewound the footage, froze the frame, and stared until the pixels blurred into meaning. The man's posture was casual, not like an agent in a hurry. It was the posture of someone who expected to return. Daniel's choices narrowed into a small set of urgent options: confront Sentinel directly, go public, or disappear again, this time with Michael and Laura as collateral damage he could not bear. Confrontation meant exposing himself and perhaps forcing a reaction. Going public meant risking Sentinel's PR machine and possible legal retaliation. Disappearing meant preserving a fragile peace while allowing Sentinel to keep its ledger. None felt like a clear moral victory. Time pressed. Michael's contact called hedged updates and then went silent. Sarah received a text late one night, short, a single sentence: "Stay quiet." The message had the same soft cruelty as Grant's voice. Laura, who had begun to sleep a little easier knowing she had someone looking for answers, now paced more and spoke less. The search that had once felt hopeful curdled into something that tasted like fear. Daniel lay awake and thought of Ethan's smile, of the small acts of trust that had built a life suddenly taken, or at least turned into a commodity. He thought of combat and of orders, of the moments when men had looked to him for decisions, and the times he had chosen silence because it seemed like stewardship. He imagined telling Laura all of it, the full weight of his choices, and watched how she might take it. With forgiveness, with rage, with something else he could not yet see. The town's harbor lights blinked like a pulse, a small mechanical heart beating time. Daniel felt his own pulse in rhythm, a drum of choice. He knew Sentinel watched. He knew people he trusted had been compromised. He knew, too, that the next move had to be the one that either forced the map into the open or burned it to ash. He feared the destruction that either outcome might bring. At dawn, he made his decision, not final, not entirely brave, but necessary. He would not go to the police yet. He would not vanish. He would try one other thing. He would contact an old friend, someone who had left the service and then gone into journalism. He would find a way to put the ledger in a place where light would be harder to smother, a place where the public could see the outline of Sentinel's work and the families would have the voices they deserved. It was a dangerous move. It might bring Sentinel down on them faster. It might ruin whatever fragile calm remained. But it also felt like choosing to act in a world that had too often let men like Ethan be erased and replaced with silence. Daniel had wandered long enough in the shadows. Now he would see if the light could be used to burn away what Sentinel hoped to hide. He sent a single message at dawn, a terse note to a number he had saved once. The line blinked a moment, then connected. As he waited, he felt the harbor wind lift and the world breathe in. Outside, a van idled at the corner in the exact shade of gray he had not seen before. Someone inside watched the shop. The game had accelerated. There was no more room for half measures. The night smelled of wet iron and something older, money that had been left in pockets too long. Fog lay low over the docks, a slow breath that made the world seem to hold its voice. Daniel drove slowly, headlights slicing the mist in two thin knives. At the warehouse, the light over the loading bay swung on an automatic timer and painted the corrugated metal in cold white. The place had the honest loneliness of a building built for work and left to time. They met under that light. Michael with his hands clenched as if he could hold his brother together that way. Laura with her coat drawn tight and her eyes red from waiting. Sarah who'd come because she wanted to fix the hole she'd helped make. Jack who moved like a man who had chased story after story and learned to believe in the power of a single good lens. Daniel's heart thudded a steady rhythm in his ribs. He carried the memory of other nights in other places with him like a small tool. It reminded him of angles and exits and where the wind might come from. Jack's phone sat on a stack of crates with its camera lens open and a low battery pack humming. "Once we go live," he whispered, "we're not taking it down. People will see what they can see." His hands shook, but his voice was steady. The plan was dangerous in the quiet, brilliant way of things that had to be done. Bait Grant into showing his hand, get the servers, broadcast the ledger, and force the world to choose whose side it would take. Grant came a half hour late, smug and small, in a perfectly tailored coat, the sort of man who made calmness an act. Two of his people, broad-shouldered, anonymous in black, stood behind him like moving shadows. He stepped into the light as if it was a stage he knew. Then his eyes found Daniel, and for a beat the warmth in his face thinned. "Mr. Mercer," Grant said, the voice polite as a ballad, "I was told you have concerns." "I want the truth," Daniel said. His voice was low and dry from too many nights without sleep. "About Ethan. About Sentinel. About the lists you're keeping and what you plan to do with them." Grant smiled, the kind of smile that had been polished for press photos and shareholder meetings. "We help families find closure. We contract for a private security consultancy, nothing illegal. We coordinate resources and supply intelligence the public sector often can't. We're the bridge." "Bridge for what?" Michael asked. "You call what you do charity? That's not how you paid, Sarah." "We offer community outreach," Grant said. His tone was patient, practiced. "Ms. Hart agreed to help us with local intel so we could direct assistance to veterans. You have to understand, private firms often move faster than bureaucracies." "You called me by name in your emails," Daniel said. "You asked for men with marks. You surveilled me." Grant's smile thinned. "We monitor to protect. We monitor to identify risk vectors. We can't help if we don't know who might be compromised." "Compromised how?" Laura asked. "How does being a veteran make my son a liability?" "You're asking the wrong person," Grant said, and for the first time his voice carried an edge. He lifted his chin and motioned to one of his men. "Bring him." From the shadow of the loading bay a man stepped, hands cuffed behind his back, a slouch, a hat pulled low. For a beat no one moved. The man lifted his face, and Michael's breath sucked out of him like the wind off the water. Ethan. The sight of Ethan, thin, beard-shadowed, one eye like a chipped glass, knifed the air between Michael and the world. Michael moved before thinking, a raw, animal lunge that had to be stopped by Sarah's hand on his sleeve. "Ethan," he said, breaking. "What? Why?" Ethan's voice came like something scraped from a throat. "Michael." He looked older, the kind of older men get when they have been given terrible choices. He said Daniel's name, too, slow, like a man tasting syllables to make sure they were safe. "Dan." Grant smiled like a man who had just revealed the punchline to a joke no one else found funny. "We found him," he said, and his voice tasted of triumph. "He was in our custody. We recovered him during a sweep. He was cooperative." The world narrowed for Daniel into the click of metal and the whisper of Jack's phone. He thought of orders barked through the dark and the tiny decisions that made the difference between life and a ledger entry. He thought of the times he had said nothing because saying something would have been to hurt more. Now words would have to be weapons or bridges. Cooperative. Michael's hand trembled when it hovered toward Ethan like asking a blessing. "You held him. You. What did you do to him?" Ethan looked at Michael as if he had been carrying a burden shaped like his brother's face. Then he did something Daniel did not expect. He reached up and pulled his hat off. He stood straighter, as if lifting a mask rather than lowering it. "I'm still me," he said. "Not all of me. I made a choice." Michael's face broke. "What choice?" Ethan turned his face toward Grant, and for the first time the man from Sentinel looked nervous. The air changed, like a room that suddenly held a secret too heavy to hide. Ethan's hand slipped into his jacket, and from inside he produced a small device, a recorder, and he held it between his fingers like a treat. "You think you brought me back to parade me," Ethan said. His voice was low, but clear. "You think you control me. You don't." Grant's smile flattened. Ethan, cooperate and we can. No, Ethan's answer was hard as a bell. You offered safety in exchange for silence. You offered my mother money for keeping her living room full of pictures and for letting you hunt men like me. You bought people. You tracked us. You labeled us. You made poor women store your checks like medicine. Daniel felt an old guilt flare. He had left pieces unsaid that might have warned Ethan. But Ethan's next move changed the shape of the whole night. He tapped the recorder with his thumb, and Jack's phone, already streaming, picked up the sound. Ethan's voice leaned close, intimate. I recorded you, Grant. I recorded meetings. I recorded the ledger transfers. I recorded the men who said veterans were liabilities. I recorded the price lists. I recorded you saying, if they resist, make it quiet. I have it all. I kept it because I swore I would never be a ledger item. The security men moved, but Daniel had already stepped forward. His training made him small, efficient. Keep your hands visible, control the distance, speak without theatrics. Play it, he said. Ethan pressed the small device. There was a rustle of paper, then Grant's own voice, slick, administrative, saying the exact words Ethan had repeated. If they resist, make it quiet. The line of Grant's jaw tightened. Even his security stiffened. Jack's live stream sent the audio feed out to the world in a matter of seconds. Viewers jumped like a flock. Comments, shares, outrage, demands. The small blue dot on Jack's screen multiplied into a roar. Grant's face went white. He tried to laugh it away. Fabrication, he said, but his words were small. The men behind him searched Ethan like they meant to find another device. Daniel moved his hand and touched Michael's shoulder, steadying him. Stay with me, he murmured. Michael leaned into him the way someone leans into a promise. Police sirens sounded in the distance. Someone had called in the live video. Jack's stream had done something that no single phone call could. It had made the scene public and immediate. Grant's men looked at each other and then at the parking lot where the lane opened, thinking of flight routes and legal briefs. Ethan raised his head. I didn't turn to them by choice, he said, and the words were a jagged thing he'd been swallowing for years. They broke me in small ways. They fed my family. They gave me a hard bed and soft lies. I hated them for it. I hated myself for taking the money. But I kept the recorder because I knew I could use it. I knew someone would need proof. Laura moved forward then, braver than any formal courage. She reached for Ethan as if touch might stitch the torn edges. He let her, and for a beat the three of them, two brothers and the mother, formed a line that meant something like forgiveness and something like loss. Grant tried one last move, reaching to pull Ethan away like a man collecting property. Before his hand closed, police SUVs rounded the corner with lights slicing the fog. Officers poured out, badges flashing, and a woman in plain clothes with a government seal moved straight to the phone jack in Grant's hand. She looked at the live feed on Jack's screen, then at the recorder Ethan held, then at Grant and his men. Her face carried the tired gravity of someone who had seen smoke before and had learned to trust the flames. You're under investigation, she said to Grant. Her words were simple, clean, the way a gavel sounds in a quiet room. You are not a leave. Grant's world tilted. He stepped back, and in that motion he looked small in a way his tailored coat could not hide. His security men dropped their stance. The ledger, the payments, Sentinel's quiet economy, moments ago they had been a private machine. Now they were global and ugly and impossible to keep under the table. In the wash of lights and questions and the low hum of the broadcast, Daniel felt a strange relief like a pressure valve opened. The truth had a weight. Now that weight was shared. Ethan, battered and complicated, was alive and holding the thing that would break a machine built on quiet. Michael wept, not a soft grief, but a raw, remaking sob. Laura's hands were brave enough to be steady. The officers took statements. Jack's live stand became a feed of faces and facts and recorded proof. Sarah, hands in her pockets, let out a noise that might have been a laugh or a cry. She walked to Daniel and touched his arm, an apology that had finally found the right hour. When the police cars left, Grant led away with hands cuffed, eyes burning with the fury of a man who had been seen. The fog began to lift. It was not a clean victory. There would be hearings, legal wrangles, damage that could not be fixed with a tape. There would be people who turned and blamed and people who remade the ledger into another story. But for the night, the ledger had been unspooled in public, and a family had found a piece of their son again. Later, when the crowd thinned and the harbor settled to its old breathing, Daniel found the bench by the lighthouse. Michael sat with his head in his hands. Ethan, still shaky, still marked by what he had survived, sat beside him. Laura kept one hand on each boy, like she would hold them both in place if the world decided to change again. Daniel looked out to the water and felt the ache of things that had been done under orders and the small, stubborn light of those who chose to tell the truth. He had been careful for so long that the act of sharing a story felt dangerous and holy at once. He had kept silent to protect, and his silence had cost. But tonight, silence had broken. "You did the right thing," Michael said to Ethan, and his voice was raw, with new understanding. Even if it took terrible steps, Ethan didn't answer. He looked at Daniel and then at the sea. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly. "I wanted you to know why I couldn't come home. I wanted you to know I tried to make something right." Daniel swallowed. The guilt that had lived in him for years did not evaporate in one night, nor did the need for accounting vanish. But the truth had a way of moving through people and changing the shape of the things they feared. He let the cold wind wash over him, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself consider that recognition could do more than expose harm. It could open the door to repair. They sat there until dawn peeled itself over the horizon, and when the light grew, the town seemed a little less patient with secrets. The trial and the hearings would be ugly and necessary. People would argue about culpability. Some would say Daniel should have said more. Some would say he'd done enough. Daniel thought of that and let the sea answer for him. Truth is messy. Justice is messy, eh? But silence is the only thing that never changes. He had chosen differently this time, and that choice would have consequences. He could already feel like a tide pulling at his ankles. He rose at last, fingers numb, and left the bench with Ethan at his side and Michael behind him, footsteps that matched the slow certainty of men who had been through the dark and now walked, awkward and honest, into the strange, thin light of morning. They spent the days that followed like people stepping through a house after a storm, moving carefully, cataloging what remained, deciding what to save. The cameras, the recorder, the live feed, each had done their small, fierce work. Grant and several of his associates were held for questioning. Sentinel Dynamics faced subpoenas and headlines, and lawyers in neat suits began the slow business of arguing whether a ledger was charity or a ledger of human lives. Public outrage lit up like flares. People who had been invisible in their own towns were suddenly in the light. For some, that light would be welcome. For others, it would feel like exposure, raw and dangerous. Daniel watched most of it at a distance. Jack's footage had made the case public, but it also turned the small circle of their lives into something crowds watched with hungry eyes. Reporters called, then stopped calling when legal teams started to speak. There were interviews and whispered phone questions and a documentary crew that wanted to tell Ethan's story as a heroic arc. Daniel refused many of them. He had always preferred being a quiet man with tools and oil-stained hands. Public life felt like a window smashed and taped up with someone else's pictures. The police did their work. Statements were taken in rooms so small that truth felt compressed, like paper folded one time too many. Daniel sat through interviews where officers asked the kinds of questions that scrape at the edges of memory. When did you first notice someone following you? Did you report the ledger? Did you recognize Grant before the night at the warehouse? He answered honestly because he had chosen that path when the recorder went live. Honesty was now the only currency that might buy real repair. There were hearings and there would be trials. The legal machine chewed through paper and testimony. Grant's men argued deniability. Sentinel's PR stepped up and promised reforms, while its lawyers pushed for settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The courtroom would be a place of battle and slow, official reckoning. It would not fix everything. It would not stitch back every wound. but it would force doors that had been shut to stay open, at least for a while. Michael did not leave Laura's side. He became a different kind of man in public, not the solitary young man with a photograph, but a son who now spoke loudly for those who could not yet speak. He organized support for other families, set up a small group of people who met at the lighthouse bench to trade notes and keep watch. There was anger there, and it had sharp teeth, but there was also care. He used the image in his wallet, Ethan's photo, less like a proof and more like a reminder. Ethan's recovery was neither straight nor easy. He carried edges that could not be smoothed by press conferences or a single night of testimony. He had hallucinations on some nights and woke with the taste of metal in his mouth. There were things he could not and did not speak of at first, but he spoke enough about being fed promises, about being paid to be quiet, about how a brand of kindness can disguise a trap. He sought help and found people who listened without reading contract clauses into compassion. Laura learned to sleep in the small hours again. She learned to trust the body of her son when it was next to hers, to listen without demanding a hero's story. Sarah, the woman who had slid payments into her account to keep the shop open, found a way to make small restitution. She worked extra hours at community kitchens, answered phones for the newcomer support group Michael started, and used every contact she had to undo what she could. Her apology was not one line on a morning show, it was a daily practical act. People did not forget easily. They did, however, respond to actions that matched words. And Daniel had to face the hardest mirror. The public, hungry for a tidy narrative, wanted villains and heroes. They wanted assignments of blame that could be signed and filed. Some people blamed Daniel for the silence he had kept. Others thanked him for finally letting the truth move. Daniel felt both the gratitude and the blame like weather, some days sun, some days a hard wind. He did not try to smooth either reaction. Instead, he made a choice that felt to him like the only honest thing left. He would testify. He would tell the court what he had seen and what he had chosen not to say and why. He would not hide his past decisions behind the pale excuse of orders. He would show the mess of it. The moments when a choice felt like the least bad option, the nights when keeping quiet felt like protection, and the mornings when guilt arrived like a bill. He expected condemnation. He also hoped that telling the whole thing would help set other things right. On the stand, he spoke plainly. He described the operation that had gone wrong, the radio silence, the orders, the confusion. He described nights when men trusted him, and he thought his silence would protect them. He described the small lies he told himself to keep moving. He watched faces in the courtroom, some angry, some grateful, some exhausted as he spoke. Testimony does not erase consequences, but it can make them visible. He watched as the recorder Ethan had kept playing back the words that had once been said in secret rooms. Listening to the conversation again was like stepping into a room where the furniture had shifted, meanings fell into new places. When he finished, he did not expect absolution. He did not get it. There were questions and cross-examinations, and the weary work of lawyers picking at phrases. But there was also a strange clearing. The facts were now part of the public record, and that mattered. It meant fewer people could simply pretend not to see. It meant Sentinel could not easily repackage what it had done as community outreach without scrutiny. After the hearings, Daniel walked back to the lighthouse bench where he had met Michael that first night. The bench had grown small graffiti and new stickers and a fresh cigarette burn. It also had new names scrawled on the underside, initials of men and women who met there to share food and stories and to watch for the small anonymous threats that come in envelopes and in polite emails. The lighthouse itself had a fresh coat of white paint. Its light burned steady, which is to say it did its job, to be there and to be seen. On the bench, Daniel sat with his sleeve rolled up. The tattoo was no longer a secret. Journalists sometimes asked to photograph it. He refused. The mark belonged to more than a story now. It belonged to memory, to loss, to mistakes, to survival. He ran a thumb over the faded ink. It did not sting anymore. Instead, it felt like a ledger entry that had been revised. He had carried it as shame and as camouflage. Now, sometimes he let it be a map, a map that could warn or guide. He did not find easy redemption. No single event absolved him of the small choices that had hurt others or of the times he had thought silence was protection. Redemption, he learned, arrived in fragments. In a letter from a soldier 2 towns over thanking him for being honest, in the way Laura smiled, not with brightness but with survival, in the small steady applause from people who came to the bench to talk. He learned to accept that some debts could not be paid back, only carried differently. One afternoon, a young man in uniform came down the harbor path. He asked for Daniel by name. He said he had read about the Sentinel case and wanted to know if he could learn boat repair. He wanted something practical and honest. Daniel looked at his hands, then at the boy and nodded. Teaching someone to fix a motor to make things run again felt like the opposite of the ledger that had once reduced people to rows. It was repaired in its gentlest form. At night, Daniel walked the dock with Michael and Ethan sometimes. They did not always speak. The water made its small, indifferent sound, and silence felt less like an accusation and more like a shared rhythm. When they did speak, they told smaller stories now about a broken lamp fixed, an old radio found a tune, a joke that had been tucked away, and was now free to be told again. Those small things did not mend everything, but they were stitches. Daniel thought often about the moral shape of his life. He had once believed that silence could shelter. He had been wrong in many ways. He had also learned that truth, once told in the right way and placed in the right hands, could be a kind of medicine. It did not heal everything. It did not take back nights, but it gave others a chance to act. It allowed families to know and to grieve and to fight. It forced institutions to answer. It made it harder for a name like Sentinel to hide behind a catchy mission statement. In the months after, the trials unfolded slowly. Grants were frozen, some executives removed. Sentinel's spokespeople talked about reforms. Activists watched and kept pressure. Lawsuits were filed. There were settlements and fines and images of men and women who had once been invisible standing for their statements. Some of the victories were legal and small. Others were personal and immeasurable. On a cold morning, with frost like sugar on the ropes, Daniel walked out of the bench and found a card tucked beneath the slat. It was from Laura. Inside, she had written simply, "Thank you for coming back." There was no theatrical forgiveness in the note, only a hand that understood history and still chose to keep a relationship alive. Daniel folded the card into his pocket and felt something like gratitude move in his chest. He learned to live with the fact that choices had consequences that spread wider than a single life. He also learned that recognition, the single moment when a young seal had seen a tattoo and could not look away, had changed everything. Recognition had been the spark that started the change, but it was not, in itself, the answer. The answer came from people willing to listen, to record, to testify, to stand in public light and say the names of wrongdoers aloud. At dusk, the lighthouse turned its beam across the harbor. Daniel watched it cut a white arc in the fog and thought about small things. A bolt tightened, a motor coaxed to life, a hand that guides another. He had once tried to make himself invisible to keep safe. Now, he understood that being seen could be messy and painful, but also necessary. He rolled his sleeve back down and let the ink sleep under fabric. It was a private map he no longer feared showing to someone who asked with steady eyes. As the light swung, he rose and walked back toward the shop. There were motors to fix, mornings to meet, and a small, steady work to do. The world would keep being complicated. People would keep needing help. He had no illusions that everything would end neatly. But he had chosen to live in the open parts of life, to let truth be a tool rather than a weapon. That choice was less a hero's ending and more a daily practice. It was enough for now. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.